The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Whitehall as tourists gathered around the iconic red sentry boxes. The royal guard stood motionless, their bearskin hats and scarlet tunics drawing crowds of admirers with cameras and smartphones. Among the sea of visitors, James Mitchell moved slowly, his weathered hands gripping a simple wooden walking stick. At 72 years old, the former Royal Navy veteran carried himself with quiet dignity. Though his left leg bore the permanent reminder of his service in the Falklands War, James had made this pilgrimage every year for the past decade, always. On the same date, today marked the anniversary of his son's death in Afghanistan. And seeing the Royal Guard in their ceremonial duty brought a sense of connection to the military family he had served with for 30 years. The precision, the honor, the unwavering commitment to duty. These values had shaped his entire life and continued to provide comfort in his grief. The crowd was thicker than usual, filled with summer tourists eager to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. James positioned himself at a respectful distance, remembering his own days of ceremonial duty when he was much younger. He understood the discipline required to stand perfectly still while hundreds of people pointed cameras, and sometimes tried to provoke reactions. The young guardsman deserved respect, not harassment. Near the front of the crowd, Marcus Webb was having a very different experience. The 30-year-old construction worker had arrived in London that morning as part of a bachelor party. Weekend, already 3 pints into what he planned to be a long day of drinking. His friends had scattered to various tourist attractions, leaving Marcus to wander alone with a growing sense of entitlement. Fueled by alcohol and a general disdain for authority, Marcus had never served in the military, had never understood the significance of the ceremonial duties he was witnessing, and frankly didn't care. To him, the silent guardsmen were nothing more than tourist attractions, living statues put there for his entertainment. The more he stared at the motionless figures, the more irritated he became by their stoic professionalism. Bet they're not even real soldiers, Marcus muttered to a nearby tourist, loud enough for others to hear. Probably just actors in fancy dress, standing there for show. His voice carried the slurred confidence of someone who had started drinking too early and had no intention of stopping. The guardsman he was staring at was Private David Chin, 22 years old, and 6 months into his service with the Grenadier Guards. David had completed tours in Estonia and had volunteered for ceremonial duties as a mark of honor. Standing at attention in the sweltering summer heat, wearing the heavy ceremonial uniform required every bit of his military training and personal discipline. Marcus stepped closer to the barrier, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "Hey, tin soldier, can you even move in that ridiculous outfit?" A few tourists turned to look, some laughing nervously, others clearly uncomfortable with his behavior. "I bet you're sweating like a pig under all that gear." James watched the situation developing with growing concern. He had seen this type of behavior before, civilians who thought military ceremony was a joke, who had no understanding of the sacrifice and dedication required. His jaw tightened as Marcus continued his verbal assault on the young guardsman. Private Chen remained perfectly motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His training had prepared him for this exact scenario. Tourists regularly tried to get reactions from the guards, sometimes through jokes, sometimes through increasingly aggressive behavior. The key was to maintain composure, to honor the uniform and the crown through unwavering discipline. But Marcus wasn't finished. The lack of response only seemed to inflame his aggression. "Look at this robot," he called out, gesturing dramatically. To his growing audience, he's probably making minimum wage to stand there like a mannequin. What a waste of taxpayer money. Several tourists began to shift uncomfortably, some pulling their children away from the increasingly volatile man. A few whispered among themselves, clearly disapproving of Marcus's behavior, but uncertain how to respond. The crowd dynamics were shifting, with most people wanting to distance themselves from the confrontation while remaining close enough to witness what might happen next. James felt his blood pressure rising. This wasn't just disrespectful behavior toward an individual soldier. It was an insult to everything the uniform represented. Every veteran who had served, every family who had lost a loved one in service, every person who understood the true meaning of duty and sacrifice. His grip tightened on his walking stick as Marcus's voice grew even more belligerent. "I bet I could make him flinch," Marcus announced, his alcohol-impaired judgment leading him toward a decision that would change everything. These toy soldiers aren't so tough when someone actually challenges them. The crowd held its collective breath as Marcus took another step forward, now dangerously close to the guardsman's position. James positioned himself slightly closer, his military instincts automatically assessing the situation and preparing for potential intervention. Something about Marcus's body language, the increasing aggression in his voice, suggested this confrontation was about to escalate beyond mere verbal harassment. Private Chen remained at perfect attention. In the young man's shoulders, the slight adjustment of his stance that indicated he was prepared for whatever might come next. The guardsman was trained for this. That didn't make the situation any less volatile or unpredictable. The morning sun continued to beat down on the scene, creating an almost surreal atmosphere where ancient ceremony met modern confrontation. Tourists continued to snap photos, many now focused on the brewing conflict rather than the traditional spectacle they had come to witness. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone involved: the disciplined soldier, the intoxicated aggressor, and the veteran observer whose own sense of honor was about to be put to the ultimate test. Marcus's next move sent a ripple of shock through the gathered crowd. Without warning, he lunged forward toward the barrier separating tourists from the ceremonial area, his movements clumsy but determined. Several people gasped audibly as he stumbled slightly, caught himself, then continued his aggressive approach toward Private Chen. "I'm going to show everyone what happens when someone actually stands up to these tin soldiers," Marcus shouted, his words echoing off the surrounding buildings. His face was flushed red, whether from alcohol, anger, or the morning heat, and his eyes had taken on the wild look of someone whose judgment had been completely compromised. Felt his heart rate spike as he recognized the signs of an imminent assault. 30 years of military service had given him an instinctive ability to read situations, and everything about Marcus's body language screamed danger. The man wasn't just planning to verbally harass the guardsman anymore. He was preparing to physically attack a soldier who couldn't defend himself without breaking protocol. The crowd's reaction was mixed and chaotic. Some tourists stepped back instinctively, creating a wider circle around the confrontation. Others pulled out their phones, apparently more interested in capturing video than intervening. A few parents hurriedly ushered their children away from the scene, while others seemed frozen in place, unsure whether they were witnessing a planned performance or a genuine crisis. "Security," someone called out from the back of the crowd. But the nearest police officers were at the other end of the ceremonial area, too far away to intervene quickly. The tourist police presence, while visible, wasn't designed to handle rapidly escalating confrontations with intoxicated individuals. Marcus reached the barrier and began climbing over it, his coordination severely impaired but his determination unwavering. "Let's see how tough you are when someone actually fights back," he yelled at Private Chen, who remained motionless despite the clear and present danger. This was exactly the scenario that James had nightmares about. A serving soldier, bound by duty and protocol to remain at attention, being attacked by a civilian while crowds watched and filmed. The young guardsman couldn't break formation to defend himself without potentially facing disciplinary action, couldn't abandon his post without dishonoring his regiment, couldn't respond with appropriate force without creating an international incident. James made his decision in that split second. His left leg might be damaged, his reflexes might not be what they were 30 years ago, but his sense of duty and honor remained as sharp as ever. No soldier should have to face assault while fulfilling their ceremonial obligations, especially not while bound by the very discipline that made them targets. "That's enough." James's voice cut through the crowd noise with surprising authority. He began moving forward, his walking stick tapping rhythmically against the cobblestones as he navigated through the mass of tourists. Despite his age and injury, there was something in his bearing that made people instinctively step aside. Marcus had one leg over the barrier when he heard James's commanding voice. He turned, swaying slightly, and saw the elderly man approaching with unmistakable purpose. "Mind your own business, old man," Marcus snarled. "This doesn't concern you." It concerns every citizen when someone attacks a serving soldier. James replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of leadership experience. He continued moving forward, calculating distances and timing just as he had been trained to do so many years ago. The contrast between the two men was striking. Marcus, younger and larger but impaired by alcohol and rage, represented everything James despised about modern society's lack of respect for service and sacrifice. James, older and physically limited but mentally sharp and morally certain, embodied the values that had guided his entire adult life. "You don't understand what that uniform means," James continued, now close enough that Marcus had to focus on him rather than the guardsman. "That young man has sworn an oath to serve his country, and he's bound by honor to maintain his position regardless of what you do to him." Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that revealed his complete lack of understanding. "Honor? These are just overpaid actors playing dress-up for tourists? There's no honor in standing around like a statue while people take pictures." The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the confrontation and the raised voices. James could see smartphones recording from multiple angles, knew that whatever happened next would likely be shared across social media within minutes. The weight of representation, not just for himself, but for all veterans, for the military tradition, for basic human decency, settled on his shoulders. "Son," James said, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone that somehow carried even more authority than his earlier commands. "You're about to make the biggest mistake of your life. That soldier can't defend himself because he's bound by duty and discipline, qualities you clearly don't understand." Marcus's response was to complete his climb over the barrier. Landing unsteadily in the restricted area just a few feet from Private Chen, the young guardsman's training was being tested to its absolute limits. Every instinct told him to respond to the threat, but his oath and his commitment to the ceremonial duty held him in place. "But I can defend him," James announced, his words carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. "And I will." The elderly veterans' declaration sent a new wave of tension through the gathered tourists. Some began backing away further, sensing that the situation was about to escalate dramatically. Others pressed closer, unwilling to miss what promised to be an unprecedented confrontation. James reached the barrier just as Marcus raised his fist toward Private Chen. Time seemed to slow as the three men, the disciplined soldier, the drunken aggressor, and the veteran protector, formed a tableau that would define this moment for everyone present. The morning sun continued to shine down on the scene, illuminating what was about to become a clash between honor and aggression, between respect and disrespect, between the values that built a nation and the selfishness that threatens to tear it down. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, shared in military mess halls and veteran gatherings across the country. As Marcus swung his fist toward Private Chen's face, James Mitchell moved with a speed and precision that belied his 72 years and injured leg, the walking stick that had been supporting James's weight suddenly became something else entirely. A weapon wielded with the expertise of someone who had been trained in close combat decades ago and had never forgotten the fundamentals. In one fluid motion, James caught Marcus's wrist with the curved handle of his stick, deflecting the punch away from the guardsman, while simultaneously stepping forward to deliver a precise strike to Marcus's solar plexus. The impact was surgical. In its efficiency, Marcus doubled over, gasping for breath, his drunken bravado instantly replaced by shock and pain. He staggered backward, his face turning from red to pale as he struggled to breathe. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds, executed with the kind of professional competence that left no doubt about James's military background. "Stand down," James commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. He maintained his position between Marcus and Private Chen, his walking stick held ready, but not threatening. "This confrontation is over."
Wait.
The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps, cheers, and nervous applause. Smartphones captured every moment as tourists realized they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A real-life hero stepping forward to protect someone who couldn't protect himself. Marcus, still struggling to breathe properly, looked up at James with a mixture of pain, confusion, and dawning awareness that he had seriously misjudged the situation. You can't. That's assault, he wheezed. One hand pressed against his chest. Self-defense, James corrected calmly. Defense of a third party, to be precise. You were committing assault against a serving member of Her Majesty's forces. I intervened using minimum necessary force to prevent that assault from continuing. The legal terminology flowed naturally from James's lips, revealing yet another layer of his background. He had served not just as a sailor, but had risen through the ranks to positions that required understanding of military law, rules of engagement, and the precise application of force. Private Chen remained at perfect attention throughout the entire confrontation. Though James could see the slight relaxation in the young man's shoulders that indicated relief, the guardsman's training had held, his discipline had remained intact, and his honor had been preserved by the intervention of a stranger who understood the sacred nature of his duty. Security personnel were now rushing toward the scene. Been alerted by the crowd's reaction and the obvious disturbance, James remained calm, knowing that his actions had been both legally justified and morally necessary. He had witnesses, video evidence, and most importantly, the clear moral authority that comes from protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, James addressed the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered tourists. What you've witnessed here today is what happens when basic respect for service and sacrifice breaks down. This young soldier, he gestured toward Private Chen, has sworn an oath to serve his country with honor and dignity. That oath includes maintaining ceremonial discipline even in the face of harassment and assault. Marcus had managed to straighten up somewhat, though he was still breathing heavily and clearly shaken by the encounter. The alcohol that had fueled his aggression now worked against him, making it difficult to process what had happened and how quickly the tables had turned. You had no right to interfere. Marcus protested weakly, but his words lacked conviction. Even in his impaired state, he was beginning to realize that he had been the clear aggressor, and that James's intervention had likely saved him from facing much more serious consequences. I had every right, James replied firmly. More than a right, I had a duty. Every citizen has a duty to protect those who serve in our defense, especially when they're bound by honor not to protect themselves. The first security officer reached the scene, quickly assessing the situation and recognizing that James was clearly not the aggressor. The evidence was overwhelming. Video footage from dozens of phones showing Marcus climbing the barrier and attempting to strike the guardsman, followed by James's controlled and measured intervention. Sir, I need you both to step away from the ceremonial area, the officer said, his tone respectful but firm. He had obviously dealt with similar situations before and recognized the need to de-escalate while maintaining the dignity of the ceremony. James nodded and began moving toward the barrier, his walking stick once again serving its original purpose. As a mobility aid, the transformation from weapon back to walking aid was seamless, almost magical in the way it demonstrated the veteran's complete control over the situation. The crowd began to part as James approached, expressed their support and admiration for his actions. Thank you, an elderly woman whispered as he passed. Oh, my grandson serves in the Navy. Thank you for defending that young man. Similar comments followed him as he moved through the crowd, each one adding to the growing sense that something significant had just occurred. This wasn't just a tourist incident or a minor scuffle. This was a moment that highlighted fundamental questions about respect, duty, and the relationship between civilians and those who serve in their defense. Marcus followed more slowly, still dealing with the physical effects of James's precisely delivered strike and the emotional impact of having his aggression so effectively neutralized. The alcohol was beginning to wear off, replaced by embarrassment and a growing awareness of how badly he had misjudged the entire situation. Private Chen remained at his post, his perfect attention never wavering despite the drama that had unfolded. Around him, his commitment to duty had been tested and proven, his honor had been defended by a stranger, and his faith in the values he served had been reaffirmed by the actions of someone who truly understood what the uniform represented. The security officer led both men to a quiet area away from the crowds, where additional personnel waited to take statements and assess the situation. James walked with dignity and composure, while Marcus stumbled along beside him, still shaken by the swift resolution of his aggressive behavior. "I'm going to need to see identification from both of you," the lead security officer, Sergeant Williams, announced professionally. He was a former military man himself and had immediately recognized something familiar in James's bearing in response to the crisis. James produced his wallet without hesitation, extracting a well-worn military ID alongside his civilian identification. "James Mitchell, Royal Navy, retired," he said simply. "Service number 247,891, enlisted 1971, retired 2001 as Chief Petty Officer." Sergeant Williams examined the credentials with obvious respect. 30 years of service, sir. That explains quite a bit about what we just witnessed." He turned to Marcus, who was fumbling through his pockets with hands that still shook slightly from the encounter. "Marcus Webb," the younger man muttered, finally producing his driver's license. "Look, I was just having a bit of fun with the guard. I didn't think anyone would make such a big deal about it." "Fun?" James's voice carried a note of disbelief. "You climbed a security barrier and attempted to assault a serving soldier. That's not fun. That's criminal behavior. That could have resulted in serious charges and international embarrassment for this country." Several witnesses had followed at a respectful distance, and Sergeant Williams began taking their statements. The story that emerged was consistent and damning for Marcus. Unprovoked verbal harassment escalating to physical assault, prevented only by James's intervention. "The old gentleman was magnificent," testified Sarah Chen, a tourist from Canada, who had captured much of the incident on her phone. "The drunk man was completely out of control, and that poor soldier couldn't do anything to defend himself. Mr. Mitchell stepped in like something out of a movie. So quick and professional." Another witness, Dr. Michael Roberts, a physician, who had been visiting from Wales, provided additional context. "I've seen enough fights to know the difference between someone losing control and someone exercising precise, measured force. Mr. Mitchell used exactly enough force to stop the assault without causing unnecessary harm. It was textbook defensive intervention." Marcus listened to the witness statements with growing unease, finally beginning to understand the seriousness of his actions and how fortunate he was that James had intervened in a controlled manner rather than allowing the situation to escalate further. "I think I need to apologize," Marcus said quietly, his earlier bravado completely gone. "I've had too much to drink, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I don't know what came over me." James studied the younger man's face, seeing genuine remorse, beginning to replace the alcohol-fueled aggression. "Son, an apology is a start, but it doesn't undo the damage. That young guardsman will remember this incident for the rest of his life. Every time he stands ceremonial duty, he'll wonder if someone else is going to try to assault him while he's bound by honor not to defend himself." The weight of James's words clearly affected Marcus, who seemed to shrink into himself as the full implications of his behavior became clear. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted. "I guess I just saw him as part of the tourist attraction, not as a real person with real feelings." "That's exactly the problem," James replied, though his tone had softened slightly. "These guardsmen aren't attractions. They're highly trained soldiers, fulfilling one of the most honored traditions in the British military. They've earned the right to respect, not harassment." Sergeant Williams finished collecting witness statements and returned to the two men. "Mr. Webb, based on the witness accounts and video evidence, committed assault against a member of the Royal Guard. However, given your apparent remorse and the fact that no actual contact was made thanks to Mr. Mitchell's intervention, we're prepared to handle this with a formal warning and a requirement that you leave the ceremonial area immediately." Marcus nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that he wasn't facing more serious consequences. "Thank you, officer. I understand completely. I'll leave right now and won't come back. As for you, Mr. Mitchell," Sergeant Williams continued, "your intervention was both legally justified and morally commendable. You used appropriate force to prevent an assault. You did so with the kind of precision that reflects well on your military training." James accepted the assessment with typical military understatement. "I just did what needed to be done, Sergeant. Any veteran would have done the same thing. Perhaps, sir, but not everyone would have done it with such skill and restraint. You prevented a serious incident while preserving everyone's dignity as much as possible under the circumstances. As the official proceedings concluded, several members of the crowd approached James to express their gratitude and admiration. Many shared their own connections to military service, sons and daughters in the forces, relatives who had served, personal experiences with the dedication required for ceremonial duty. "My father served in the Grenadier Guards," said one elderly gentleman, extending his hand to James. "He would have been proud to see what you did today. Thank you for upholding the honor of the service." A young mother with 2 small children in tow stopped to speak with James as well. "My children need to see that there are still people willing to stand up for what's right," she said. "Thank you for showing them what real courage looks like." Each interaction reinforced the broader significance of what had occurred. This wasn't just about stopping one drunk tourist from harassing a guardsman. It was about defending fundamental principles of respect, honor, and civic responsibility that seemed increasingly rare in modern society. Marcus, meanwhile, was quietly making his way toward the exit, clearly shaken by both the physical confrontation and the moral reckoning that had followed. The alcohol was wearing off, replaced by embarrassment and a growing understanding of how badly he had misjudged both the situation and the character of the people involved. As he reached the edge of the ceremonial area, Marcus turned back for one last look at the scene. Private Chen remained at perfect attention, his duty continuing unchanged despite the drama that had swirled around him. James was still surrounded by well-wishers, accepting their gratitude with the modest dignity that marked everything he did. 3 hours later, the ceremonial area had returned to its normal rhythm, but the story of James Mitchell's intervention was already spreading far beyond Whitehall. Videos from the incident had been uploaded to social media platforms where they were being shared thousands of times with comments, ranging from admiration for James's actions to outrage at Marcus's behavior. James had returned to his hotel room, where he sat quietly reviewing the morning's events. The adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by the familiar ache in his left leg, and a deep satisfaction that he had been able to honor his own service by protecting someone else's. He had called his daughter Emma to tell her about the incident before she saw it on the news or social media. "Dad, you could have been seriously hurt," Emma had said, her voice mixing pride with concern. "Oh, you're not 25 anymore, and that man could have turned violent." "He did turn violent, sweetheart," James had replied gently. "That's exactly why I had to intervene. That young guardsman couldn't protect himself without breaking his oath and dishonoring his regiment. Someone had to stand up for him." The conversation with Emma had reminded James of why the morning's events mattered so much to him. His son David had died serving in Afghanistan, killed by an IED while on patrol with his unit. David had been about the same age as Private Chen, filled with the same sense of duty and honor that bound all soldiers together across generations and conflicts. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb was experiencing a very different afternoon. He had returned to his hotel room, showered, and spent considerable time staring at himself in the bathroom mirror. The face, looking back at him, seemed like a stranger, someone capable of attacking a defenseless soldier, someone who had needed to be stopped by a 72-year-old veteran with a walking stick. The physical impact of James's defensive strike had faded, but the emotional and psychological effects were just beginning. Marcus found himself thinking about his own grandfather, who had served in World War II and had always spoken with reverence about military service and duty. What would the old man think about his grandson's behavior today? Marcus's phone buzzed, with messages from his friends who had seen the videos circulating online. Instead of the support he might have expected, the messages were uniformly critical and embarrassed. "Mate, what were you thinking?" Read one. "You made us all look like idiots," said another. Back at the ceremonial site, Private Chen was nearing the end of his shift. The incident with Marcus had tested his training and discipline in ways that actual combat deployments never had. In Estonia, the rules of engagement were clear, and the threats were obvious. Here, bound by ceremonial protocol and the need to maintain the dignity of the crown, He had been forced to trust in the honor and decency of strangers to protect him from assault. James's intervention had done more than prevent physical harm. It had reaffirmed Chen's faith in the values he served. The veteran's quick, decisive action had demonstrated that the military brotherhood extended beyond active service, that the bonds forged by shared commitment to duty and country lasted a lifetime. As Chen prepared to be relieved by the next guardsman, he reflected on the morning's events. The vast majority of tourists who visited were respectful, even reverent, toward the ceremony and its participants. They understood, at least instinctively, that they were witnessing something larger than mere pageantry, a living connection to centuries of military tradition and sacrifice. But incidents like the one with Marcus were becoming more common. Fueled by alcohol, social media attention-seeking, and a general decline in respect for authority and tradition. The fact that James Mitchell had been there, had been willing to intervene, suggested that the values Chen served still mattered. To people who truly understood their significance, the news media had begun picking up the story by late afternoon. Local reporters arrived at the ceremonial site to interview witnesses and capture footage for evening broadcasts. The narrative that emerged was compelling and clear. A military veteran defending a serving soldier from assault, embodying the values of honor and sacrifice that the ceremony itself represented. This is exactly the kind of story that reminds us why these traditions matter, commented historian Dr. Margaret Whitfield in an interview with BBC London. The ceremonial duties performed by the Royal Guard aren't just tourist attractions. They're living symbols of the commitment and sacrifice that have preserved our freedoms for centuries. The incident also sparked broader discussions about public behavior, alcohol consumption, and respect for military personnel. Social media commentators debated everything from tourist etiquette to the appropriateness of James's physical intervention. Though the overwhelming sentiment was supportive of his actions, Emma Mitchell had driven down from Manchester after her conversation with her father, worried about his well-being and wanting to make sure he was processing the day's events in a healthy way. She found James in his hotel restaurant, quietly eating dinner and reading messages of support that had somehow found their way to him through various channels. "How are you really doing, Dad?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. James looked up from his phone, his weathered face showing the exhaustion that comes after a day of high stress and emotional intensity. "I keep thinking about David," he admitted, "about how he would have handled a situation like that, and about how I would have felt if someone had attacked him while he was serving." Emma reached across the table to squeeze her father's hand. "David would have been proud of what you did today, would have understood exactly why you had to intervene." "I hope so," James replied quietly. "I've spent the last decade trying to honor his memory, trying to live up to the example he set. Today felt like the most important thing I've done since his funeral." The conversation between father and daughter continued late into the evening, processing not just the day's dramatic events, but the deeper questions they raised about duty, honor, and the obligations citizens have to protect those who serve in their defense. It was a conversation that was being repeated in various forms across the country as news of the incident continued to spread. 6 months later, the ripple effects of that morning's confrontation were still being felt across multiple lives and institutions. The incident had become something of a watershed moment, sparking changes that none of the participants could have anticipated when they first found themselves facing each other on that summer day in Whitehall. James Mitchell had become something of a reluctant celebrity, though he handled the attention with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. Interview requests came regularly. He accepted only those that allowed him to speak about military service and the importance of supporting serving personnel. The story had given him a platform to honor his son's memory and advocate for veterans, causes in ways he never could have imagined. The Royal British Legion had invited James to speak at their annual conference, where his words about the continuing bonds between veterans and active duty personnel resonated deeply with audiences. Across the country, "Service doesn't end when you take off the uniform for the last time," he had told them. "The oath to defend those who serve continues for as long as we draw breath." Private David Chen had been promoted and transferred to a new assignment, but not before writing a letter to James that the veteran treasured above all the media attention and public recognition. Sir Chen had written, "Your intervention that day did more than protect me from physical harm. It reminded me why the uniform I wear matters and why the values it represents are worth defending, even from those who don't understand them." Letter had arrived on the anniversary of David Mitchell's death, providing a sense of closure and purpose that helped James process his grief in new and healing ways. His son's sacrifice had meaning because people like Chen continued to serve with honor, and because people like James himself remained committed to protecting that service. Marcus Webb's transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of all. The shame and embarrassment he felt after the incident had led to serious self-reflection and eventually to a complete change in his lifestyle and perspective. He had stopped drinking, begun volunteering with veterans organizations, started educating himself about military history and the significance of the traditions he had so carelessly attacked. 3 months after the incident, Marcus had written a lengthy letter to James, apologizing again for his behavior and explaining the changes he was making in his life. To his surprise, James had responded with an invitation to meet for coffee, beginning an unlikely friendship that benefited both men. "I was angry and entitled and completely ignorant," Marcus had told James during one of their regular conversations. "I thought military ceremony was just theater, just something put on for tourists. I had no idea about the sacrifice and dedication behind it." James had become something of a mentor to Marcus, helping him understand not just military culture, but the broader concepts of duty, honor, and service that extended far beyond uniformed personnel. Their relationship demonstrated the power of redemption and the possibility that even the most misguided behavior could lead to positive change. The incident had also prompted changes within the ceremonial units themselves. Additional security measures were implemented to better protect guardsmen from harassment, and new protocols were established for dealing with aggressive tourists. More importantly, the public support generated by James's actions had led to increased funding for veterans programs and enhanced recognition for ceremonial duties. Private Chen. Now Corporal Chen had been selected to participate in a special ceremony honoring James and other veterans who had demonstrated exceptional support for serving personnel. The event, held at the Tower of London, brought together military leadership, veterans organizations, and community leaders to recognize the continuing bonds between past and present service members. Today we honor not just individual acts of courage, but the enduring spirit of service that connects all who wear the uniform, declared the commanding officer during the ceremony. James Mitchell's actions remind us that military service is not just a job or a phase of life, it's a lifelong commitment to protecting the values and institutions that define our nation. Emma Mitchell watched her father receive his recognition, with tears in her eyes, knowing that this honor represented more than just acknowledgement of a single moment of courage. It was validation of a lifetime of service and sacrifice, both his own and her brother David's. The ceremony concluded with James being presented with a special commendation from the Royal Guard, signed by the commanding officers of all 5 regiments. But perhaps more meaningful to him was the private moment afterward when Corporal Chen approached him with a small, wrapped package. "Sir, this belongs to you," Chen said quietly, presenting James with a folded flag that had flown over the ceremonial area on the day of the incident. "This flag represents everything you stood for that morning and everything we continue to serve." James accepted the flag with hands that trembled slightly, not from age or injury, but from the overwhelming emotion of the moment. "Thank you, son," he managed to say. "This means more to me than you can possibly know." The media coverage of the ceremony sparked a national conversation about the role of veterans in modern society and the importance of maintaining connections between military and civilian communities. Schools began inviting James to speak about service and citizenship, and his simple, direct approach to these topics resonated powerfully with young people who had never considered the military as anything more than an abstract institution. Marcus Webb was among those watching the ceremony, having followed James's story closely since their reconciliation. The transformation in his own life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. He had enrolled in university courses on military history, begun volunteering at veterans care facilities, and discovered a passion for preserving the stories of older veterans whose experiences might otherwise be lost. James showed me that it's never too late to understand what really matters. Marcus had told a local newspaper reporter who was writing about second chances and personal redemption, he could have written me off as just another drunk idiot. But instead, he helped me become someone better. The friendship between James and Marcus had become a symbol of the broader healing and understanding that the incident had generated. Their regular coffee meetings drew attention from other veterans and community members, creating an informal support network that expanded far beyond its original participants. As the first anniversary of the incident approached, found himself reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed. The quiet retirement he had planned had been replaced by a new sense of purpose and connection. His grief over David's death remained. It was now balanced by the satisfaction of knowing that his son's sacrifice continued to inspire others to serve and support those who served. The final surprise came on that anniversary morning, when James returned to the same spot in Whitehall where everything had begun. He wasn't alone. Emma had come with him, along with Marcus, several members of his veterans group, and even some of the tourists who had witnessed the original incident and had stayed in touch through social media. But the most meaningful presence was that of Corporal Chen, who had arranged to be on ceremonial duty specifically for this commemoration. As James approached the guardsman's position, Chen subtly nodded, a tiny breach of protocol that acknowledged their shared bond and mutual respect. 1 year ago, I came here to remember my son, James said to the small gathering around him. Today, I'm surrounded by people who understand that memory isn't just about the past. It's about continuing the work that those we've lost started. The crowd was quiet as James placed a wreath at the base of the ceremonial area, a gesture that honored not just his son's memory, but all those who had served and continued to serve. The morning sun cast the same long shadows it had a year before, but everything else had changed in ways both profound and permanent. As the small ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, James remained for a few more minutes, watching. Corporal Chen maintained his perfect attention and thinking about the chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. A single act of courage, performed in defense of honor and duty, had created ripples that continued to spread, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that would last for generations. The walking stick that had served as both support and weapon now rested easily in James's hand as he prepared to leave. But he knew he would return, not just as a grieving father honoring his son's memory, but as a guardian of the values that made such honor and sacrifice meaningful. The circle was complete, but the story would continue as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost.